Miguel wiped the sweat from his forehead as he pushed his cleaning cart down the long marble hallway. It was just after 6 in the morning, and the Conservatorio Nacional de Música was still quiet. This was his favorite time of day, before the students arrived with their expensive instruments and designer backpacks, before the professors rushed through the halls talking on their phones, before anyone really noticed he existed. He'd been working here for 3 years now. 3 years of mopping floors, emptying trash cans, and cleaning the bathrooms. 3 years of being invisible. But Miguel didn't mind being invisible. In fact, he preferred it that way. Because being invisible meant he could observe. He could listen. He could learn. The conservatory was one of the most prestigious music schools in all of Mexico City. Students came from wealthy families all over the country, sometimes from other parts of Latin America, too. Their parents were doctors, lawyers, business owners. They drove expensive cars and wore expensive clothes. They belonged here. Miguel knew he didn't. At least that's what everyone would think if they knew his story. He grew up in a small village in Oaxaca, about 8 hours south of the capital. His father worked in the fields, and his mother sold tamales at the local market. There were 5 children in the family, and Miguel was the youngest. Money was always tight. Some months they barely had enough to eat, let alone pay for things like music lessons or instruments. But music was always there. In his village, music was everywhere. The old men played guitars in the town square on Sunday afternoons. During festivals, mariachi bands would fill the streets with sound. His uncle played the accordion at weddings and celebrations. Miguel remembered being 5 years old, watching his uncle's fingers dance across those buttons, creating melodies that made people laugh and cry and dance all at the same time. That's when he knew. Music wasn't just sound, it was magic. And he wanted to create that magic too. His parents tried to encourage him. His mother would let him bang on pots and pans in the kitchen. His father once borrowed a guitar from a neighbor and let Miguel hold it, though he had no idea how to play it. But lessons cost money. Instruments cost money. And money was something they simply didn't have. When Miguel turned 18, he made the difficult decision to leave his village and come to Mexico City. He promised his parents he would send money home. He promised himself he would find a way to be around music, even if he couldn't afford to study it properly. Finding work wasn't easy. The city was overwhelming at first. So many people, so much noise, so many buildings stretching up toward the sky. He stayed with a distant cousin in a cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city. He took whatever jobs he could find. Construction work, washing dishes at restaurants, delivering packages on a borrowed bicycle. Then one day, he saw an advertisement. The conservatory needed a janitor. Miguel's heart nearly stopped when he read it. A chance to work inside a music school, to be surrounded by music every single day. He applied immediately. The interview was short. The head of maintenance, a tired-looking man named Roberto, asked him if he had experience cleaning. Miguel said yes. Roberto asked if he could work early mornings and late evenings. Miguel said yes. Roberto asked if he had a problem with hard work. Miguel almost laughed. He'd worked in the field since he was 6 years old. Nothing could be harder than that. He got the job. The first few weeks were like a dream. Every day, Miguel arrived at 5 in the morning and left around 2 in the afternoon. He cleaned practice rooms where students played piano and violin. He mopped the floors of the grand concert hall where orchestras rehearsed. He emptied trash cans in the offices where famous professors taught music theory and composition. But more than cleaning, he listened. Oh, how he listened. He learned that there were different types of classical music. Baroque, Romantic, Contemporary. He learned the names of famous composers, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms. He learned that the way you hold an instrument matters just as much as the notes you play. During his lunch break, Miguel had a secret routine. After eating his simple meal of beans and tortillas, he would slip into the back row of the main auditorium. If there was a class or rehearsal happening, he would sit there in the darkness, completely still, absorbing everything. The way the professor explained a difficult passage, the way a student's posture affected their sound, the breathing techniques for wind instruments, the finger positions for strings. Nobody ever noticed him there. Or if they did, they didn't care. He was just the janitor, part of the furniture, invisible. At night, in his tiny apartment that he now rented on his own, Miguel practiced. He'd saved up for 3 months to buy a guitar from a flea market. It wasn't a good guitar. The neck was slightly warped, and 2 of the tuning pegs were loose, but it was his, and it was enough. He didn't have books or videos to learn from. He only had his memory. He would remember what he'd seen and heard during the day, then try to recreate it at night. His fingers would fumble at first, struggling to find the right positions. His neighbors would sometimes bang on the wall, telling him to be quiet. But slowly, gradually, he started to improve. He taught himself to read music by sneaking looks at the sheets students left behind in practice rooms. He would quickly photograph them with his old phone before throwing them away. At home, he would study those photos for hours, connecting the dots on the page to the sounds in his memory. His co-workers thought he was strange. Why did he take such care when cleaning the concert hall? Why did he sometimes stand frozen in doorways, his mop hanging limply in his hand, just listening to a piano student practice scales? They shrugged it off. Everyone had their quirks. Miguel sent money home to his parents every month, just as he'd promised. It wasn't much, but it helped. His mother would call him and ask when he was coming to visit. He would make excuses. The truth was, he was saving every extra peso he had. Not for a visit home, not for better clothes or a nicer apartment, but for a better guitar, for strings, for a music stand, for all the small things that serious musicians took for granted. 3 years passed this way. 3 years of cleaning by day and practicing by night. 3 years of being invisible while building something in secret. Miguel never told anyone about his practicing. What would be the point? He was a janitor from a poor village in Oaxaca. People like him didn't become musicians. People like him stayed in their place. But sometimes, late at night when he played, Miguel would close his eyes and imagine something different. He would imagine walking onto that stage not with a mop, but with a guitar. Not to clean, but to perform. The audience would listen, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Because the music meant something. Then he would open his eyes, look around his cramped apartment, and remind himself that some dreams were too big. Some dreams weren't meant for people like him. He should be grateful for what he had, a job, a roof over his head, the chance to be near music, even if he could never truly be part of that world. He had no idea that everything was about to change. The announcement went up on a Tuesday morning. Miguel saw it while emptying the trash can near the main bulletin board. A large poster with elegant lettering announced that Maestro Enrique Dominguez would be visiting the conservatory. He would judge the annual student guitar competition and conduct a master class for the advanced students. Miguel's hands trembled slightly as he held the trash bag. Maestro Dominguez. Everyone in the classical guitar world knew that name. He'd performed in concert halls across Europe and the Americas. He'd recorded albums that won international awards. He'd studied under some of the greatest guitarists in history. And now he was coming here. The students were buzzing with excitement and nervousness. Miguel overheard their conversations as he cleaned the hallways and practice rooms. Some were thrilled at the opportunity to learn from such a master. Others were terrified, because Maestro Dominguez had a reputation, and it wasn't entirely good. Yes, he was brilliant. Yes, he was accomplished. But he was also known for being harsh, critical. Some even said cruel. Stories circulated about students who'd been reduced to tears during his master classes, about performers he'd humiliated in front of audiences. He had little patience for mistakes and even less tolerance for what he called mediocrity. He believes only certain people are meant to play classical guitar, one student told another as Miguel mopped nearby. If you don't come from the right background, if you haven't had the right training since childhood, he thinks you're wasting everyone's time. Miguel felt something twist in his stomach. People like him, the student meant. People without money, without connections, without the advantages that open doors in this world. The day of Maestro Dominguez's arrival came on a Thursday. Miguel had started his shift at 5 in the morning as usual, but today there was extra pressure. Everything had to be perfect. The concert hall had to shine. Not a single piece of trash could be visible. The windows had to be spotless. The head of maintenance had made that very clear. Miguel worked carefully, taking pride in his work as he always did. By noon, the concert hall looked beautiful. The wooden floor gleamed. The seats were dust-free. The stage was pristine. Students began filing in around 1 o'clock, carrying their guitar cases, whispering nervously to each other. Then he arrived. Maestro Enrique Dominguez was in his early 50s, with silver hair swept back from his forehead. He wore an expensive suit and carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. 2 assistants followed him, carrying his belongings. The director of the conservatory greeted him with enthusiastic handshakes and smiles. Miguel watched from the side entrance, staying out of the way. The maestro's eyes swept across the auditorium with the assessing gaze of someone who noticed every detail. For a brief moment, his eyes passed over Miguel without really seeing him. Just another janitor, just part of the scenery. The competition began. One by one, students took the stage and performed. Some played beautifully. Others struggled with nerves or technical difficulties. Maestro Dominguez sat in the front row, his face impassive, occasionally making notes on a pad of paper. His comments after each performance were sharp and precise. To one student, he said the interpretation lacked emotional depth. To another, he pointed out technical flaws in the fingering. To a third, he simply said, "You haven't practiced enough. I can hear it in every measure." Miguel should have been working, but he found himself frozen near the back of the auditorium, listening. He recognized the pieces the students were playing. He'd heard them practice dozens of times in these halls. He'd tried playing some of them himself late at night in his apartment. The competition ended around 4 o'clock. Maestro Dominguez announced the winners with little fanfare, then dismissed the students. He would return the next day for the master class, he said. The students filed out, some looking relieved, others disappointed. Miguel began his afternoon routine, entering the auditorium to clean up. A few students had left water bottles and sheet music scattered around. He collected them quietly, working his way down the aisles with his cleaning cart. That's when he noticed that Maestro Dominguez hadn't left. He sat alone in the front row, reviewing his notes from the day. His assistants stood near the entrance, talking quietly on their phones. The director had gone to his office. Miguel tried to be as quiet as possible. He didn't want to disturb the famous maestro, but as he worked his way toward the stage, he saw it. Someone had left a guitar on the stage, a beautiful classical guitar with a warm, honey-colored finish. Probably one of the competition participants had forgotten it in their nervousness. Miguel climbed the steps to the stage, intending to retrieve the guitar and set it safely backstage. But as he reached for it, he couldn't help himself. He paused. His fingers hovered over the strings. It was such a beautiful instrument, so much finer than his battered flea market guitar. He wondered what it would sound like, what it would feel like to play something of such quality. "You there?" The voice cut through the silence like a knife. Miguel jumped, his heart racing. He turned to see Maestro Dominguez staring at him from the front row. "Yes, you, the janitor." The maestro's tone was sharp, impatient. "What are you doing?" "I'm sorry, senor. I was just going to move this guitar backstage. Someone left it here. You were staring at it like you wanted to play it." The maestro's eyes narrowed. There was something calculating in his expression now, something that made Miguel deeply uncomfortable. "No, senor, I was just—" "Come now. Don't lie. I saw the look on your face. The maestro stood up, walking slowly toward the stage. "Tell me something. Do you play guitar?" Miguel's mouth went dry. He should say no. He should just apologize, take the guitar backstage, and get back to work. But something in the maestro's tone told him that no matter what he said, this wasn't going to end well. I practice a little. At home. Just for myself." "Ah." The maestro's face broke into a smile, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a cat that had just cornered a mouse. "How fascinating. A janitor who plays guitar. Tell me, where did you study?" "I didn't study, senor. I taught myself." "You taught yourself." The maestro repeated the words slowly, as if they were the punchline to a joke. "And tell me, what do you play? Do you know any real classical pieces or just popular songs?" Miguel felt heat rising in his face. He knew he was being mocked, but he couldn't quite understand why. What had he done to deserve this? "I know some classical pieces," he said quietly. "Do you now?" The maestro had reached the stage now. He gestured broadly toward the guitar. "Well then, this is a perfect opportunity. Why don't you show us what a self-taught janitor can do? I'm curious." By now, a few students who'd been lingering in the hallway had heard the commotion. They drifted back into the auditorium, curious about what was happening. The maestro's assistants looked up from their phones. Even the director of the conservatory appeared at the entrance, drawn by the sound of voices. Miguel looked at all these faces staring at him. He saw the smirks on some of the students' expressions. He saw the amusement in the maestro's eyes. He understood now what was happening. This wasn't a genuine invitation. This was entertainment. He was the joke. "Come on, don't be shy," the maestro said, his voice dripping with false encouragement. "Pick up the guitar, play something for us. I insist." Several students had pulled out their phones now. They held them up, ready to record, ready to capture what they assumed would be a humiliating spectacle. The poor janitor who thought he could play guitar. This would be a funny story to share later. Maybe it would even go viral online. Miguel's hands shook. Every instinct told him to put down the guitar, apologize, and leave. To go back to being invisible, to stay in his place. That would be the safe choice, the smart choice. But then something else stirred inside him, something that had been building for 3 years, 3 years of listening in the shadows, 3 years of practicing alone in his apartment, 3 years of believing that people like him didn't deserve to be heard. Maybe he didn't deserve to be mocked either. Miguel picked up the guitar. He adjusted the strap over his shoulder. His fingers found their positions on the neck of the instrument. The auditorium fell silent. The students waited, phones recording, ready for the show. Maestro Dominguez settled back in his seat, arms crossed, that mocking smile still playing at his lips. Miguel closed his eyes. He took a deep breath, and then he began to play. The first notes floated through the auditorium like drops of water falling into a still pond. Soft, delicate, clear. Miguel had chosen one of the most challenging pieces in the classical guitar repertoire, Recuerdos de la Alhambra by Francisco Tárrega, Memories of the Alhambra. It was a bold choice, maybe even a reckless one. The piece required a technique called tremolo, where the guitarist's fingers had to move so rapidly and precisely that they created the illusion of a continuous, flowing melody, like a fountain cascading in a Spanish courtyard. One mistake, one hesitation, and the entire illusion would shatter. The smirks on the students' faces began to fade within the first few measures. This wasn't what they'd expected. This wasn't a fumbling amateur struggling through a simple tune. This was something else entirely. Miguel's right hand moved with incredible speed and control. His thumb played the bass notes while his other 3 fingers created that shimmering tremolo effect. His left hand moved up and down the neck of the guitar, finding each position with quiet confidence. He didn't look at his hands. He didn't need to. His eyes remained closed, and his face showed complete concentration. More people had gathered now. Students who'd already left the building heard the music and came back inside. Faculty members appeared in doorways. The security guard who normally stood at the entrance drifted closer, drawn by the sound. Even the maintenance workers stopped what they were doing to listen. The piece told a story. You could hear it in the notes. Longing, beauty, nostalgia. The melody wove through major and minor keys, creating moments of joy mixed with sadness. It was the kind of playing that made you forget you were listening to just one instrument. It sounded like an entire orchestra compressed into 6 strings. Maestro Dominguez sat frozen in his seat. The mocking smile had vanished from his face. His arms were no longer crossed. He leaned forward now, his eyes fixed on Miguel with an expression that was hard to read. Shock, certainly. But something else, too. Something that looked almost like recognition. The students had lowered their phones. They weren't recording a joke anymore. They were witnessing something they hadn't expected to see. Several of them knew this piece. They'd attempted to play it themselves in practice rooms. They understood just how difficult it was. And this janitor, this man they'd never paid attention to, was playing it better than most of them could ever hope to. One girl in the 3rd row had tears streaming down her face. She wiped them away quickly, embarrassed, but the music had touched something deep inside her. That's what great music did. It bypassed the brain and spoke directly to the heart. Miguel moved into the middle section of the piece, where the melody climbs higher and the emotion intensifies. His fingers never faltered. The tremolo remained smooth and even. Every note rang out clearly, perfectly timed, perfectly weighted. This wasn't just technical proficiency. This was artistry. Roberto, the head of maintenance, stood in the back of the auditorium with his mouth hanging open. He'd worked with Miguel for 3 years. They'd eaten lunch together countless times. They'd talked about soccer and weather and the rising cost of rent. Never once had Miguel mentioned that he could play guitar. Never once had he given any hint of this hidden talent. The piece required not just speed but also incredible finger independence. Each finger had to move at precisely the right moment, striking the string with exactly the right amount of force. Too hard, and the notes would sound harsh. Too soft, and they would disappear. Miguel had found that perfect balance. The sound was warm, resonant, beautiful. As the piece progressed, something magical happened in that auditorium. The social barriers that usually divided people began to dissolve. It didn't matter anymore that Miguel was a janitor and they were students. It didn't matter that some came from wealthy families and he came from a poor village. The music created a space where those distinctions lost their meaning. In that moment, they were all just human beings sharing in something beautiful. The director of the conservatory stood near the entrance, his hand over his mouth. He was thinking about all the times he'd walked past Miguel in the hallways without really seeing him. All the times he'd treated him as invisible, as just another employee whose job was to keep the building clean. Shame mixed with amazement on his face. Miguel played on, lost in the music now. He wasn't in the conservatory anymore. In his mind, he was somewhere else. He was in his village, watching his uncle play accordion at a wedding. He was a child again, listening to the old men play guitar in the town square. He was sitting in the darkness of this very auditorium, absorbing everything he'd seen and heard over 3 years. All of those moments, all of that love for music, all of that patient learning in secret, poured out through his fingers now. The tremolo technique requires enormous stamina. Most guitarists' hands begin to tire after a few minutes. But Miguel had practiced this piece hundreds of times in his apartment. His fingers had built up the strength and endurance needed. They moved tirelessly, maintaining that flowing, fountain-like quality that made the piece so special. Near the end, there's a section where the melody seems to float, suspended in air, before gradually descending back to earth. Miguel played it with such delicacy that several people in the audience held their breath. afraid that even breathing might disturb the fragile beauty of the moment. Then came the final measures. The piece ended quietly, gently, like a memory fading as you wake from a dream. Miguel played the last few notes with infinite care, letting each one resonate fully before moving to the next. The final note hung in the air for a long moment. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence. Miguel opened his eyes slowly, as if waking from a trance. He looked out at the auditorium and saw dozens of faces staring back at him. For a heartbeat, no one moved, no one breathed. Then one student started clapping. Just one. A young man in the fifth row who understood exactly what he'd just witnessed. His applause echoed in the quiet auditorium. Another student joined him, then another. Then suddenly everyone was clapping, and the applause grew from a trickle to a wave to a thunderous ovation. Students who'd been smirking minutes before were now on their feet, applauding with genuine enthusiasm. Faculty members clapped, the maintenance workers clapped, even the security guard was clapping. Miguel stood on the stage, the guitar still in his hands, completely overwhelmed. His legs felt weak, his heart pounded. He'd never played for anyone before except his empty apartment walls. Now dozens of people were applauding him, celebrating him, seeing him, really seeing him, for the first time. But it was Maestro Dominguez's reaction that mattered most. The famous guitarist sat motionless in the front row while chaos erupted around him. His face had gone pale. His hands rested on his knees, not clapping, just gripping his own legs as if he needed to steady himself. Slowly, very slowly, he stood up. The applause began to quiet as people noticed the maestro rising. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at Miguel. His expression was complicated. There was shock, yes. Amazement, certainly. But there was also something that looked like shame. Deep, profound shame. He walked toward the stage with measured steps. Miguel watched him approach, still not quite able to process what had just happened. The maestro climbed the stairs to the stage. He stopped a few feet away from Miguel. The entire auditorium had gone silent again. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. The phones were back up now, but for a different reason. This was a moment people would want to remember. Maestro Dominguez extended his hand, not in a condescending way, not with the superiority he'd shown earlier, but with genuine respect, the kind of respect one musician offers another. "Forgive me," he said. His voice was quiet, but in the silence of the auditorium, everyone heard it clearly. "I judged you without knowing you. I made assumptions based on nothing but prejudice and arrogance." Miguel shook his hand, still too stunned to speak. "Where did you learn to play like that?" the maestro asked. And this time, the question wasn't mocking. It was genuine, full of real curiosity and respect. Miguel found his voice, though it came out shakier than he would have liked. "Here," he said simply. "I learned here, by watching, by listening, every day for 3 years." The maestro's eyes widened. "You taught yourself by observation?" "And practice, every night, in my apartment." Miguel paused, then added quietly, "I couldn't afford lessons. But I couldn't stop loving music either." Something shifted in the maestro's expression. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of something he'd forgotten long ago. Maestro Dominguez turned to face the audience, still holding Miguel's hand. The auditorium remained silent, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. The maestro's voice, when he spoke, carried a weight that made people lean forward to catch every word. "What I just heard," he began, "is proof that I have been wrong about many things. For years, I believed that only those with formal training, with proper education from childhood, could truly master classical guitar. I believed that talent without pedigree was worthless." He paused, and Miguel saw something he never expected to see on the face of such a famous musician: tears. The maestro's eyes were wet. But this young man has just taught me a lesson. Talent doesn't care about your background. Passion doesn't ask for your credentials. Music doesn't discriminate. We do. People like me. We create walls where there should be doors. The students stood frozen, watching their idol admit to prejudice and arrogance. Some looked uncomfortable. Others nodded slowly, as if they too were recognizing something in themselves. The maestro turned back to Miguel. "What's your name?" "Miguel. Miguel Garcia." "Miguel Garcia." The maestro repeated it slowly, as if committing it to memory. "How old are you?" 24, senor." "And you've been teaching yourself for how long?" "Seriously, for about 3 years, but I've wanted to play since I was a child." The maestro shook his head in wonder. 3 years, with no teacher, no formal guidance, just observation and determination. He looked out at the students again. "Some of you have been studying since you were 5 years old, with private tutors, with expensive instruments, with every advantage money can buy. And yet what I just heard from Miguel surpasses what I heard from many of you this afternoon." A few students shifted uncomfortably. One girl who'd placed third in the competition had tears on her face, though whether from inspiration or frustration, it was hard to tell. "Miguel," the maestro said, his voice becoming firm with decision, "I want to offer you something. I run a private music academy in the Polanco district. It's small, only 12 students at a time, but it's intensive. World-class instruction, full-time study." Miguel's heart began to race. He wasn't sure where this was going, but the possibility forming in his mind seemed too incredible to be real. "I want to offer you a full scholarship, room, board, instruction, everything. If you're willing to dedicate yourself completely to music, I will personally take you on as a student." The auditorium erupted in applause again, but Miguel couldn't hear it. His ears were ringing. His vision seemed to blur at the edges. A full scholarship. Personal instruction from one of the greatest guitarists in Latin America. It was everything he'd ever dreamed of, but never dared to believe could happen. Miguel's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," the maestro replied with a slight smile, "unless you enjoy mopping floors more than playing guitar." That got a laugh from the audience, breaking some of the tension. But Miguel's mind was racing with practical concerns. "My job. I send money to my family. My parents depend on that." The maestro nodded. "I understand. The scholarship includes a small stipend. Not much, but enough to live on and to send something home. Your only job will be to study, to practice, to develop your gift." "Why?" Miguel asked suddenly. "Why are you doing this?" The maestro was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer, more vulnerable than before. "Because 30 years ago, someone gave me a chance. A professor at the conservatory in Madrid saw past my arrogance and my mistakes and gave me an opportunity I didn't deserve. He told me that someday I would need to pass that gift forward. I didn't understand what he meant then. I think I do now." He gestured toward the guitar Miguel still held. "Besides, talent like yours is rare. To let it waste away would be criminal, and I have a lot to make up for, starting with the way I treated you 20 minutes ago." Miguel looked down at the guitar in his hands. His calloused fingers, rough from years of manual labor, rested on the strings. He thought about his parents in Oaxaca, his mother selling tamales at the market, his father working in the fields. They'd sacrificed so much to give him and his siblings whatever life they could manage. What would they think? Would they be proud? Or would they think he was abandoning them, choosing his dreams over his duty to help the family? As if reading his thoughts, the maestro added, "You can call your parents. Talk to them tonight. Think about it. But Miguel, opportunities like this don't come often. Some people wait their entire lives for a door to open. You need to recognize when you're standing in front of one. The director of the conservatory approached the stage, looking flustered. Maestro Dominguez, perhaps we should discuss this. Miguel is our employee, and there are procedures. The maestro cut him off with a sharp look. Then follow your procedures, but nothing you do will change my offer. He looked back at Miguel. Think about it. I'm staying at the Hotel Reforma. Call me tomorrow morning with your decision. He pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to Miguel. Miguel took it with trembling fingers. The card was simple, but elegant. Enrique Dominguez, master guitarist and instructor, a phone number and email address. The maestro stepped back and addressed the crowd one more time. Let this be a lesson to all of us. The next time you see someone and make assumptions based on their job or their clothes or where they come from, remember today. Remember Miguel. Remember that greatness can be hidden in the most unexpected places. With that, he descended from the stage and walked up the aisle toward the exit. His assistants scrambled to follow him. The director stood there looking confused and somewhat annoyed, but he didn't say anything else. The students began to approach Miguel. Some wanted to congratulate him. Others asked questions. How long had he been playing? What other pieces did he know? Could he teach them the tremolo technique? A few pulled out their phones and asked for photos. Miguel felt overwhelmed by the attention. Just an hour ago, these same students had been ready to laugh at him. Now they treated him like a colleague, like someone worth knowing. It was disorienting. Roberto pushed through the crowd and grabbed Miguel's shoulder. Why didn't you ever tell me you could play like that? Miguel shrugged helplessly. Would you have believed me? Roberto laughed, but there was sadness in it. Probably not. That's my shame to carry. He paused. Are you going to take his offer? I don't know. It seems impossible. Things like this don't happen to people like me. They just did. Roberto squeezed his shoulder. Don't be an idiot. Take the chance. Eventually, the crowd dispersed. Students had to go home. Faculty members returned to their offices. The maintenance workers went back to their duties. Miguel stood alone on the stage, still holding the guitar that didn't belong to him. He carefully placed it back in its case and set it backstage where it would be safe until its owner returned for it. Then he looked around the empty auditorium. This place where he'd been invisible for 3 years. This place where he'd learned everything by watching from the shadows. He pulled out his phone and looked at the time. It was past 6 o'clock. He should have finished work 2 hours ago. He would need to make up the time tomorrow. That is, if he was still going to have this job, if he was still going to be the janitor. Miguel walked slowly through the halls he'd mopped countless times. He saw them differently now. Everything looked different. The world had shifted somehow, and he wasn't sure if it would ever shift back. He took the bus home to his tiny apartment. On the ride, he stared out the window at the city passing by. Mexico City at dusk, with its millions of people, each carrying their own dreams and disappointments. He wondered how many of them had talents they'd never shown anyone. How many had gifts they'd hidden because they thought the world wasn't interested. When he got home, he sat on his bed and pulled out the maestro's business card. He turned it over and over in his fingers. A phone call. That's all it would take. One phone call tomorrow morning, and his entire life would change. But first, there was another call he needed to make. Miguel picked up his phone and dialed his parents' number. His mother answered on the third ring. Miguel, is everything okay? You usually don't call until Sunday. Mama, he said, and his voice broke. Something happened today. Something incredible. And I need to tell you about it. He told her everything. The competition, the maestro's mockery, the performance, the scholarship offer. His mother listened in silence until he finished. Then she said something he would never forget. Mijo, when you were 5 years old, you told me you wanted to make magic with music like your uncle. I told you that maybe someday you would. I didn't know how. I didn't know when. But I knew. A mother knows what lives in her child's heart. Miguel wiped tears from his face. But the money I send you, we will manage. We always have. Miguel, you cannot build your life around our struggles. You must build it around your dreams. That's what parents want for their children. That's the only thing that matters. Are you sure? I have never been more sure of anything. Call that maestro tomorrow morning. Say yes, and then play. Play like you did today. Play for yourself. Play for us. Play for everyone who ever believed their dreams were too big. After they hung up, Miguel sat in silence for a long time. He looked at his old guitar, the one from the flea market, leaning against the wall. 3 years of practice on that imperfect instrument. 3 years of believing he wasn't good enough to be seen. Tomorrow morning, he would make the call. Tomorrow morning, everything would change. But tonight, he picked up his guitar one more time. And in his small apartment, with no audience but the walls, Miguel played. He played until his fingers ached and his heart felt full. He played because he could, because he was finally, truly, allowed to. Miguel called the maestro at 8 o'clock the next morning. His hands shook as he dialed the number on the business card. The maestro answered on the second ring, and when Miguel said yes to the scholarship, he could hear the smile in the older man's voice. Good. I'll handle the paperwork. Be ready to start in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks to transform from janitor to full-time music student. It seemed impossible, but Miguel had learned something important the day before. Sometimes the impossible just needed someone brave enough to reach for it. Telling Roberto and the other maintenance workers was harder than he'd expected. They were happy for him, genuinely happy, but there was sadness too. Roberto pulled him aside during lunch break. You're going to forget about us when you're famous, he said, but his tone was gentle, teasing. Never, Miguel replied. How could I forget the people who let me be invisible long enough to learn? The 2 weeks passed in a blur. Miguel gave his notice at the conservatory. The director, still somewhat embarrassed about the whole situation, gave him a generous severance payment. Some of the students threw him a small party in one of the practice rooms. They brought cake and took photos together. It was strange being treated as an equal by people who'd never noticed him before. One girl, a violin student named Anna, approached him quietly near the end of the party. I've been thinking about what the maestro said, about making assumptions. I walk past homeless people playing music in the metro every day. I never stop to listen. I always thought their music wasn't worth my time. She paused, looking ashamed. You've changed how I see things. Miguel didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. Maybe that was the real gift of what had happened. Not just his scholarship, but a reminder to everyone who witnessed it that talent and worth aren't determined by circumstances. The day finally came when Miguel moved to the Maestro's Academy in Polanco. It was in a beautiful old colonial building with high ceilings and large windows that let in streams of golden sunlight. The practice rooms were soundproofed and equipped with the finest instruments. There was a small library filled with sheet music from every era of classical guitar history. Miguel met the other students. They came from different countries: Brazil, Argentina, Spain, Japan. All of them were serious musicians who'd been playing since childhood. All of them had impressive credentials and training. Miguel felt intimidated at first, worried he wouldn't belong even here. But the maestro had changed. He was still demanding, still precise in his critiques, but the cruelty was gone. He pushed his students hard because he believed in them, not because he wanted to break them down, and he pushed Miguel hardest of all. You have raw talent, the maestro told him during their first private lesson. But talent alone isn't enough. You have gaps in your knowledge, music theory, sight reading, understanding of different composers and styles. We need to fill those gaps while maintaining what makes your playing special. Miguel worked harder than he'd ever worked in his life. He woke at 5 in the morning to practice before breakfast. He studied music theory until his head hurt. He learned to read complex scores that looked like foreign languages at first. His fingers developed new calluses on top of the old ones. Some nights he fell into bed so exhausted he barely remembered his own name. But he loved it. Every challenging moment, every frustrating practice session, every time he had to play the same measure 50 times to get it right. This was what he'd dreamed of. This was the magic he'd wanted to create since he was 5 years old. The other students accepted him quickly. They respected his dedication and his unique perspective. While they'd learned through formal structure, Miguel had learned through observation and intuition. Sometimes he approached pieces in ways they'd never considered. He taught them things too, and that surprised everyone, including himself. 6 months into his training, the maestro made an announcement. The academy would be holding a small concert. Each student would perform one piece. Friends, family, and members of the classical music community would be invited. It would be Miguel's first public performance as an actual student, not just a janitor who happened to play. Miguel chose to perform the same piece he'd played that day in the conservatory auditorium, Recuerdos de la Alhambra. It felt right, like closing a circle. But this time, he wanted to play it even better, to show how much he'd grown. His parents made the long trip from Oaxaca for the concert. Miguel met them at the bus station, and when he saw his mother, he nearly cried. She looked older than he remembered, more tired, but her smile was the same. His father embraced him with rough, work-worn hands and said nothing. But Miguel felt everything in that grip. The night of the concert, Miguel stood backstage in the Academy's performance hall. It was smaller than the conservatory auditorium, more intimate, but that made it more nerve-wracking somehow. Through a crack in the curtain, he could see the audience filing in. His parents sat in the third row, looking slightly out of place in their simple clothes among the well-dressed music patrons. But they held their heads high. Maestro Dominguez found him backstage. Nervous? Terrified, Miguel admitted. The maestro smiled. Good. Fear means you care. Fear means it matters. Just remember why you play. Not for them, not for me. Play because the music needs to exist in the world, and you're the one giving it life. Miguel nodded, trying to absorb the wisdom. Also, the maestro added, his tone becoming softer. I invited some people from the conservatory, some of the students who were there that day. I thought they should see how far you've come. Miguel's stomach flipped, more pressure, but also maybe more meaning. When his turn came, Miguel walked onto the stage. The lights were bright, making it hard to see faces in the audience. He sat down with his guitar and adjusted the microphone that would amplify the delicate sounds. He took a breath. Then he played. The piece flowed from his fingers like water, like light, like memory itself. But it was different from 6 months ago. Technically, he was more precise. His tremolo was even smoother. His understanding of the piece's emotional architecture was deeper. He'd learned when to push, when to pull back, when to let silence speak as loudly as sound. But more than technique, there was something else in his playing now. Confidence. Not arrogance, but the quiet confidence of someone who finally knows their place in the world. Someone who has stopped apologizing for taking up space. The piece ended. The applause came, warm and genuine. But what Miguel would remember most was seeing his mother's face. She was crying, but smiling through the tears. His father sat beside her, his rough farmer's hands clapping with fierce pride. After the concert, people crowded around Miguel, music critics who wanted to know his story, students from the conservatory who told him he'd inspired them. One woman, A programming director for a concert series, gave him her card and said she wanted him to perform next season. But the moment that mattered most came later, when the crowd had thinned. An older man approached, walking slowly with a cane. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You don't know me," the man said, "but I'm Professor Ortega. I taught Enrique, Maestro Dominguez, when he was young and foolish and full of himself." Miguel recognized the name. This was the professor the maestro had mentioned, the one who'd given him a chance 30 years ago. "I'm retired now," the professor continued. "But Enrique called me and told me I needed to hear you play. He said you reminded him of why music matters, not as a career or a competition, but as something essential to the human spirit." The old professor smiled. "Keep playing, young man. Not because you're talented, not because you won a scholarship, but because the world needs people who believe in beauty enough to chase it, even when everyone tells them they don't belong." Miguel thanked him, his voice thick with emotion. That night, back in his small room at the academy, Miguel sat with his parents. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. His mother told him news from the village. His father asked technical questions about the guitar that showed he'd been paying more attention than Miguel realized. Before they left to return home the next day, his mother held his face in her hands. "You're doing it, mijo. You're making the magic. Your uncle would be so proud." After they left, Miguel did what he always did when emotions ran too deep for words. He picked up his guitar. He played softly so as not to disturb the other students sleeping in nearby rooms. He played for his parents, for the professor, for the maestro who'd learned humility, for Roberto and the maintenance workers, for the students who'd recorded his performance expecting mockery but received art instead. And he played for that 5-year-old boy in Oaxaca who'd watched his uncle play accordion and decided that someday, somehow, he would make that kind of magic too. The old guitar from the flea market still hung on his wall. He'd never sell it, never replace it. It was a reminder of where he came from and how far he'd traveled. But more than that, it was proof of something he now knew with absolute certainty. Your dreams don't care about your circumstances. Your talent doesn't need permission to exist. And sometimes, the people who try to humiliate you end up becoming the ones who open doors you never knew were there. Miguel had stopped being invisible. But he'd never forget what it felt like to be seen only as a janitor, because that memory kept him humble, it kept him kind, and it reminded him that in every person you pass, in every face you ignore, there might be someone extraordinary waiting for their moment to shine. The music played on, and so did Miguel, not because he had to, but because now, finally, he was free to.